Insulations. Does world island mean the whole presence of the worlds at a place and at a particular time? Yes. Contrary to the generally accepted view so far, the world is not this great whole that God and other jovial observers have spread out before them. Rather, worlds appear in the plural and have an insular structure. In some ways, islands are extracts from models and are inhabited, and they can be used as world models. This is why we have to know what is meant by a minimal, complete island, an island capable of being a world. In my chapter Insulations, in my book Spheres 3, I distinguish between three kinds of island. Absolute islands, such as a space station, which is completely isolated. Relative islands, such as a hothouse for plants. And anthropogenic islands with a structure that could allow human beings to emerge on them. The anthropogenic island is a self-insulating dynamic system resembling a human incubator. Apes are put in, and people come out. How is that possible? If we argue in Darwinist and philosophical terms, how can apes enter into such self-reflexive relationships? How was the anthropogenic engine started? I describe this island as a 9-dimensional space in which each individual dimension has to be given to allow the effect of anthropogenesis, of becoming a human being, to occur. If just one dimension is missing, we fail to get a complete human being. It begins with what I call the chirotope, the space of the hand. What does the hand have to do with anthropogenesis? The answer to this question yields an initial theory of action, an elementary kind of pragmatism. Next I deal with the phonotope, the auditory space in which the self-hearing group resides. Then comes the uterotope, the space of deep affiliations, followed by the thermotope, the heat spheres or pampering space, and the erototope, the jealousy space and the field of desire. On the latter, I would note that the development of species-specific jealousy was extremely important for the process of humanization. Because human beings are mimetic animals that never stop jealously and vigilantly watching what other people are doing. Indeed, they even imitate those who successfully pretend not to watch what others are doing. This is followed by the ergotope, the space for war and struggle, the thanotope, the space for coexistence with the dead, in which religious symbols dominate, and finally the nomotope, the space of the legal tensions that give a group normative security. Buckminster Fuller's theory of tensegrities plays an important role for this aspect. Modern apartment culture can be derived from this general island theory because an apartment will only function if it is convincing as a minimal, complete island for the individual. Dwelling places. Doesn't this description include the definition of dwelling of human beings as beings that reside? Not really. In my book I develop what dwelling means in a long opening sequence of one of the chapters. I describe step by step how the different dimensions of house dwelling become explicit. You have to understand that houses are firstly machines for killing time. Admittedly, this is a rather curious theory. In fact, people wait in a primitive farmhouse for a silent event in the fields outside that they cannot influence but that comes regularly, thank God. They wait for the moment when the fruits they have planted ripen. This means that at first people only live in a house because they acknowledge the belief that it is worth waiting for an event outside the house. In the farming world, the temporal structure of house dwelling was seen from the perspective of being compelled to wait. This kind of being in the house was first questioned in the Middle Ages when urban culture began to spread in northwestern Europe. Since then, growing sections of the European population have been integrated into a culture of impatience, or being unable to wait. In Goethe's time, only 20% of people were urbanized, and 80% still lived under the old agrarian conditions. Heidegger, whom I regard in this context as the last real philosopher of peasant life, continued to conceive existential time as waiting time, and consequently as boredom. The event this waiting leads to is naturally something profoundly simple, that things will become ripe on the field of becoming. The philosopher equates this field with world history, without considering that the world of the cities can no longer be field-shaped. In the city, things do not ripen, they are produced. Having defined dwelling as halted existence, and the house as the bus or train stop, I move on to the house as a reception centre, as the sorting place for important and unimportant things. The original house is an acclimatization plant. People spend considerable time there, which means they acclimatize unconsciously, and their habits unify with the surroundings. When that happens, they have created the background that makes unusual things possible in the first place. In this sense, dwelling is a dialectical practice. It makes itself useful for its opposite. Perhaps we should briefly mention that in this opening sequence you cast Wilhelm Flusser in the role as Heidegger's opponent. The arc of suspense could not be greater. Where the one argues ontologically, the other makes things technically explicit. And where the one assesses modern human beings' losses in terms of the past, the other sees things pointing towards a new start. And this is why the two men belong together in a wider perspective. My third step develops the theorem of embedding or immersion. The philosophical theory of being in that Heidegger established is extended here. The question of what it means to be inside something is answered. How does it happen? I illustrate these questions with the aid of some statements by Paul Valéry, who interpreted what being in means in terms of the paradigm of architecture. Valéry thought architecture meant that human beings enclose human beings in works made by humans. This touches on the totalitarian side of architecture. Finally, in the fourth stage of the explication, the real nervous system of the phenomenon of dwelling is exposed. The definition of the house as an immune system. This is done by focusing particularly on the dimension of atmosphere design, of the air we breathe in the building. Part of the venture of modern architecture is that it has made the apparently immaterial facets of existence, human beings stay in an atmospheric environment, technologically and aesthetically explicit. The modern art of housing will not be able to return again behind this level of skill in designing casings for human beings. If you go through these steps in my book, it will be clear what I mean when I claim that the apartment and the sports stadium are the key architectural icons of the 20th century. At this point, we can return to Benjamin's path once more, but we arrive at different answers to the ones arcades gave. To conceive the interior nowadays, we first have to practice monadology. One person, one apartment. A monad. A world cell. Although it used to be one bachelor, man or woman, one apartment. That's right. Modern housing construction is based on a celibate ontology. In the same way as modern biology defines life as a successful phase of an immune system, from the perspective of architectural theory, we could define existence as the successful phase of a one-person household. Everything becomes integrated. The world and the household are one. But a one-person existence can only be successful, if at all, because there is architectural support that makes the apartment into a completely artificial world. In other words, the early modernist architects were right to see themselves as portraying humanity. Eliminating the megalomania factor leaves us with the fact that the architects of the first one-person apartments enabled a historically singular type of human being on a mass scale. At most, this was prefigured by the Christian ascetics. Individuation. You describe the apartment as a studio of relationships with the self. Considering that human history began with the formation of hordes, with a rudimentary form of division of labour during hunting, the emergence of this type of human being with its singular reproduction, a being that can live almost autonomously, is rather disturbing. Two questions about this. Earlier you described intimacy, dyadic intimacy, as spatially constituent. What remains of this in apartment culture? And are there any forms of spatially significant coexistence between the extremes of single and masses, isolation and assembly? The first question is easy to answer. The apartment individualists have discovered a process by which people as singles can create a couple within themselves. This happens in such a way that the person selects the event setting for his or her own life. In other words, the mode of judgmental observation. Individuals in event culture constantly differentiate themselves from themselves. They can choose their own self as their interior other. Strong individualism presupposes that one keeps the second pole and the other poles that belong to a completely rounded personality structure inside oneself. This psychostructural possibility is prefigured in ancient European culture. Its origins can be traced back to antiquity. The classical examples are the hermit monks who went to the Theban desert to the south of Alexandria, a few days' walking distance, and settled there to pray. As far as we know, they had a fairly rich interior life. The most famous of them, St. Anthony, was visited so often by torturing spirits that he could not be described as being alone. In modern terms, we would say he lived with his hallucinations as roommates. Nowadays, he would probably be in a psychiatric hospital and dosed with tranquilizers. What's the difference between this extreme form of individuation and autism? Autistic people do not have the degree of inner space that allows them to be in their own company. The idea of individual structure, on self-completion and interaction with themselves, is deeply rooted in media anthropology, and only explicable in terms of media history. The minimal formal conditions for self-completion are that a so-called single is integrated into a dyad, whether with real or imaginary others. The question of the social life of isolated people is more difficult. What will become of the animal from the small group Homo sapiens if it sits there in its pure individual representation as the sole inhabitant of its world apartment? The question is worrying. Two possible answers come to mind. The first one would be that the individual imitates the whole horde. That implies the task of representing 12 people in one's interior. In the absence of the real other, this is how a complete social structure would necessarily be simulated. In psychology, the formation of a multiple personality is seen as a symptom of illness, as the development of a seriously disturbed personality. From our point of view, the multiple personality would be nothing but the individual's response to the disappearance of the real social environment. It would be a plausible reaction to chronic social under-challenging. The other possibility comes from modern practices of networking. The horde returns as the address book. Physical proximity is no longer a necessary condition for sociability. The future belongs to tele-socialism. The past returns as the life of tele-hordes. Under the heading Dialectics of Modernization, you describe how the entire centre of society becomes filled with illusory images of the centre. In Spheres 3, I try to explain why the concept of society should vanish from our vocabulary, along with the concepts of revolution and masses. The human conglomerate that has been called society since the 18th century is built on monadological or nuclear units of life forms. Moreover, we can see that it constitutes numerous milieu hordes, specific groupings that organise as subcultures. Think of the world of horse lovers, a huge subculture you could lose yourself in for your whole life, yet it is nearly invisible if you are not a member yourself. There are hundreds of such other milieus in the social field at present, all typically constituting the centre of the world themselves and barely existing for others. I describe them as inter-ignorant or mutually ignorant systems. They are necessarily set up in a way that they can't or shouldn't know each other, otherwise their members would be cheated of enjoying their specialisation and exclusiveness. If you had encyclopedic tendencies and peeked into hundreds of scenes, you would get nothing out of it. In terms of profession, there are only 2 or 3 types of person who can afford such polyvalence. In the first place, there are architects who, at least virtually, build for everybody. Then novelists who put people from all kinds of different scenes into their novels. And lastly, clerics who have to make graveside speeches for all sorts of odd people. And the list ends there. In other words, the multiple personality on the one hand and single networking on the other. Those are the 2 possibilities for completion that I see operating in individualist populations. Doubtless the predisposition of Homo sapiens, passed down from the anthropological hordes, cannot be overcome. But because the explication of the old legacy is progressing simultaneously on several sides, the horde-like or social moments of the life of sapiens can be revised for today's special needs. The rather more dyadic theme, that is, intimate relationships, is explained up to the point at which intimacy is formally imitated by self-completion mechanisms. That provides the starting point for new evolutionary forms. The more collective features derive from telesocial tendencies and milieu tribalism. Looking towards the longer term, this will lead to the emergence of human types who are rather different from anything we have known so far. The models you describe for the impartment from the early modernists to Kurakawa and for urbanism to Constant were valid for the 1960s. After that, a change of direction occurred in architecture, based on a reconsideration of the city. The city in particular as something that cannot be grasped, defined or reduced. The concept of the capsule disappeared. The city was seen as a weave that was defined as typology on the one side and urban morphology on the other. This was the beginning of the triumphal march of postmodernism that sidelined into the utopian approaches of the 1960s. Foam. Well, please allow me to explain, or defend, the capsule motif again in a different way. I am not concerned with the excluding aspect that characterises encapsulated relationships. I am more interested in a critique of the textile metaphors that urban studies and network theory have been using in recent years. Talking about nets and weaves encourages a tendency towards despatialization, or disregarding space that I see as dangerous. In network thinking, there are only interfaces and points derived from the model of 2 or more intersecting planes or curves. This results in a world picture whose constituent element is the point. Network theorists think radically non-spatially, that is, 2-dimensionally, and they use concepts of anorexia nervosa to express their relationship to the environment. Their graphics reveal that the isolated point in the world is seen as an interface between lines without any volume. In contrast, I use the concept of the foam bubble, or the cell, or the capsule if you like, to show that the isolated element already has an expansion of its own. We should not revert back to an ontology of points, but should start by assuming the cell fit for the world as a minimal element. A little more monadology can do no harm, but a monad is not an extendable point. It is more like a micro-world. I am not interested in the capsule metaphor as such, because the cell metaphor is much more important. The term cell expresses the content of the world and the form of the world contained in the individual point. Weave and net metaphors bring us at most to tiny nodes, but we cannot inhabit nodes. The foam metaphor, however, highlights the microcosmic unique spatiality of each individual cell. The foam metaphor as the implosion of a universal unity, a globe, is a fantastic image. This still leaves the question of which characters these metaphors have when they are conceived in connection with architecture. Architects tend to take images literally. That has already happened. Fry Otto quite intentionally tried to extract nearly natural, or organomorphic, spatial creations from soap bubbles. Fry Otto used experiments with soap bubbles and soap film to demonstrate that minimal surfaces, that is, surfaces with the same tension, are the optimal form for load-bearing in constructions made with membranes and tensile structures. That is rather different from a formal loan from the realm of biology or nature. In fact, he was concerned with geometrical questions in relation to the use of materials and power dissipation. The foam metaphor supports an intellectual virtue. It prevents us from reverting to the oversimplifying Platonic geometries of traditional architectural history. Foam has no square forms, and that is interesting news. However, there are also no simple spherical structures anymore, at least when the foams have left their wet or autistic stage. Contradictory forces of deformation are always at work inside them, with the result that we end up dealing with structures that are not smooth, in which more complex geometric laws apply. What is the argument against the right angle? The basic idea of this theory of multiple spaces can only be understood if at the same time we keep in mind the reflections on alternative statics that run through the whole of the third volume of my book. We live in an age in which the function of classical statics, of loading and carrying and stress-bearing constructions, has been replaced by constructions under traction. In other words, tension totalities. I am thinking mainly, of course, of Buckminster Fuller's tensegrities, as well as the pneumatic constructions and air structures of the 20th century. The new logic of structures works entirely beyond the wall and the pillar. Tension tonalities are the technical transition between the foam metaphor and modern construction forms. Foam is a kind of natural tensegrity, the more so when it no longer appears as individualistic foam in which soap bubbles float past each other in a liquid solution, barely touching each other. When foam becomes older and drier, a complex interior architecture develops. Many bubbles burst, the remaining air from the bursting bubble merges into the neighbouring bubble, and the foam dries out from the inside. Beautiful, architecturally sophisticated shapes, the polyether foams, are created in the process. Polyether foam is characterised by the theme of co-isolation, which means we and our neighbours share our mutual separation. My walls and your walls, and we have the situation in common of being turned away from each other. My walls are your walls, and we have the situation in common of being turned away from each other. The concept of co-isolation is fundamental for the universe of foamy forms. The neighbourhood of world designs, or living spaces inside a co-isolated structure, has a different quality from the neighbourhood of spaces within traditional segmented cultures. There, everything is socially segmented. The world is like a conglomerate of isolated farms. The image of the potato sack that Marx used in the 18th Brumaire to describe the situation of peasants farming parcels of land in France perfectly describes the situation of wet foam. In that case, each cell flows past the other cells without reference to the world around it. They do not touch each other, however much they resemble each other. How much is left over from the foam metaphor of the psychosocial structure of the space, and how much from the constructivist approach of spatial constitution? In my opinion, foam is a very useful expression for what architects call density, which is another negentropic factor, by the way. Density can be expressed in psychosocial terms by a reciprocal stress coefficient. Human beings create atmosphere by urging each other to get closer to one another. We should never forget that what we call society implies the phenomenon of the unwelcome neighbourhood. Density, therefore, is also an expression for our over-communicative constitution, which, by the way, is continually goaded on by the dominant ideology of communication. By contrast, anybody who takes density seriously arrives at praise for the wall. This observation is no longer compatible with the classical modernism that set up the ideal of the transparent house, the ideal of mapping interior relationships onto exterior relationships and vice versa. Today we are focusing once again on the isolation capability of a building, which should not be confused with massiveness. Isolation, taken as an independent phenomenon, is used to explicate the living relationship of neighbourhood, which remains rather weak in my book. It would have required writing a song of praise to isolation that would explore a dimension of coexistence which acknowledges that human beings have an infinite need for non-communication. The dictatorial features of modernism all derive from a false version of communicative anthropology. The dogmatic view of an over-communicative image of human beings has been naively accepted for far too long. We should conclude by talking about the different levels of abstraction that the Spheres project covers. It is a philosophical sketch of a theory of space. It uses knowledge from anthropology, biology, and psychology, and from medicine and the social and natural sciences, engineering, technology, etc. These areas are sometimes like digressions and can be read as essays in their own right. Is philosophy still the meta-theory that succeeds in integrating all these fields of knowledge?